Hey, team players, here we are today talking about the Houston Texans. And the reason we're doing fantasy football by going through team by team is because we need to know how the teams are going to respectfully use their players. And it doesn't matter whether the team is going to be winning a lot of football games, in this case. It's how are they going to use their players to make things happen. And the big difference between the Houston here and the Vegas that we talked about last week, or yesterday rather, this is not a situation of players in a hot seat. This is a known rebuild, and we're going to invest. So therefore, all of the fears I was talking about, like with the Renfro types yesterday, about them not being on the Raiders and the team checking out, that's way less likely to happen because Houston knows what they're doing. Now, granted, they did completely mess up by having way too many one-year contracts, as we talked about earlier before the draft. But in terms of their skill rooms, they actually look like they might have built a possibility if Stroud becomes something. And one of the things that I was discussing about in April that has not changed since then is that he does not like throwing the ball into tight windows. He has always had one of the best offensive lines in front of him, which he will not have.
And you're talking about Stroud.
Yes, talking about Stroud. The Texans had the 25th offensive line this year. You get a quarterback who's not comfortable putting the ball in the tight spaces and is not used to being chased. It doesn't lead itself to the propensity of having a lot of confidence that a lot of points are going to be put on the board down in Texas. So when I look at this, that's a starting apparatus that I think this might be the lowest scoring offense in the NFL. And once you identify that, if they're not going to be the lowest, they're going to be one of the bottom five, it really, really diminishes the love I'd want for any of their players. And the one who's going the highest on the list, being the running back, might be the one I'm least excited about. Because Damien Pierce, while looking good as a rookie, was in a situation where at least there was competent downfield attempting to throw the ball. Granted, not well. I'm not going to try to say that at all. But there was attempting to put the ball downfield. I don't think we're going to have that. I think we're going to literally have another example of a Ohio State quarterback being way over his head, running for dear life, and we're going to have Chicago South. I don't want anything to do with this offense. And I'm sorry for just being a buzzkill, but it's how it is.
So when we talk about Damien Pierce is a player that seemed to come out of nowhere last year. He's had some good production on the ground. And the story, the narrative is that once teams caught on to him, they were able to stop him because there was no tangible threat down the field. Now, Houston did play a good game against Kansas City. I don't know how that happened. There was a lot of games.
Played a good game against Philly, too.
There were a lot of games that they were not out of it right away. And then there were other games where they were out of it right away. And I don't know how much of that was on coaching, how much was it on, Davis Mills. But with Pierce, he's going at running back 19. And I want to make this comparison just so everybody can understand kind of why I value Pierce lower than a couple other guys.
Okay, yeah.
Pierce is being drafted as the running back 19. You're going to have to get him in the 4th or 5th round. Guys that you're going to be drafting in that range, Dobbins, somewhere in there. You're probably going to be thinking about
like Cam Akers' world.
Cam Akers' world is somewhere in there. But a good comparison for Pierce is Pacheco. And the reason I put this comparison out there is, and it's not a good comparison in terms of for Pierce.
Or talent level? Because Pacheco's more talented.
This is the comparison. I can get Pacheco in the 5th, 6th rounds of drafts. He's going to see more red zone opportunities, limited competition in terms of running backfield. We know McKinnon is going to catch the ball more. Pacheco is going to run the ball more definitively.
Yes.
We know he's going to get red zone opportunities.
Yes.
Pierce, not going to get red zone opportunities at all. But you're drafting Pierce 2 rounds higher than Pacheco. That doesn't seem to work out, particularly thinking that Kansas City's offensive line is ranked 3rd. Houston's is ranked 25th. Houston is probably going to be out of games a lot more than Kansas City is going to be definitively. And you're taking him 2 rounds earlier than Pacheco. Well, why? So let's take a look at that. Pierce had, 800 yards last season, 4 rushing touchdowns. That means he's not getting the ball. They're not getting into the red zone.
4.3 a carry.
Yeah, he's not getting into the red zone to do anything with those balls. And then you look at it and you say, well, did they improve? No. So you're looking at it. He had 939 yards last year, almost a 1,000-yard rusher. I think he missed a couple of games somewhere in there. Very limited upside here with this pick if you're going with it. Then they bring in
I can I just put this point to the fantasy strategy? Having Damien Pierce being normally the first receiver or running back that's taken for guys that are doing the heavy receiver start is why I hate the heavy receiver start. If Damien Pierce needs to be anywhere near my starting lineup, I have failed at fantasy football.
So back to the news and the stats here. They brought in Devin Singletary. And typically speaking, when you bring in a veteran to help out a team, some people say, well, they got to use him. Well, that wasn't the case a couple years ago with Robert Woods going to Tennessee. And so you look and you say, okay, well, Singletary is definitely a guy that could eat into Damien Pierce's work, particularly in the passing game on third down.
They had very similar numbers to each other last year.
He could definitely eat into the rushing work. Buffalo's a better team than the Texans, and so there's something to say about that. But Singletary is being drafted as the 43rd running back off the board. And so Pierce's value at that point in time with limited touchdown upside, you're falling into volume-only carries. And last year he had a pretty decent amount of carries, I think about 16 a game. I don't see that coming higher at 20.
No.
I don't see that going higher. So he's going to have to be super uber efficient and get touchdowns. That all points to me to say, don't take Damien Pierce as the running back 19. But what it does point and tell me when I'm taking a look at the Houston Texans overall, their wide receiver room is super cheap. And
so cheap.
We talked about...
Should be cheap, though.
When we talked about Vegas, we talked about how I liked Hunter Renfrow as a guy that you could throw in as one of the last rounds and say, okay, see what happens. A guy from Houston that you would want to do that with would be John Mechie. John Mechie was drafted really high last year, was out due to leukemia, looks good so far in camp, being the wide receiver number 74 overall. Nico Collins, wide receiver 60 overall, 173rd in an ADP. This all predicates that Stroud's going to be able to get them a ball. We don't think
I think overall, between the two of them, it's more likely to work with Collins because he's taller and he can jump higher. And therefore, if you're just panic chucking it, it's more likely that Collins will bring it in than Mechie. I think that Collins has a legitimate chance of being the clear target leader. But with that being said, I don't think it's going to result in many touchdowns.
Yeah, and again, these guys are probably not going to crack your starting roster at all.
Unless one of them hit. These two, Mechie and Collins, are lottery picks.
Absolutely.
And they deserve to be in that category.
They have some limited upside. A guy that people don't talk about much here is Schultz. We talked about when we were looking at our ESPN rankings back in June. We're out on Schultz this year. One of the main reasons we're out on Schultz this year is that he's coming from a highly productive offense to a low production offense. Now, granted, Stroud could get him the ball. There could be some PPR points there, but he's the tight end 11 off the board. And in a 12-man league, Higbee would be a better option in PPR. Cole Kmet we have as being a better option. Sam Laporta from Detroit would be a better option. Potentially Michael Mayer, the rookie, over in
maybe both
Vegas.
The Patriots guys.
Hunter Henry, you have.
But here's the argument people are going to have at draft day. Rookie tight ends love throwing the ball, or rookie quarterbacks love throwing the ball at tight end. And the long story short is Schultz is not athletic enough to get open by himself. He wasn't really able to do it last year post-injury in Dallas. He's certainly not able to do it without CeeDee Lamb opening the field up for him and a diverse running back backfield game that Dallas had. it's going to be a dead year. If you draft Schultz, you'll be cutting him before October.
I believe that's true. And this is the important thing to remember when you're drafting your team is if you have built a solid first 2, 3, 4 picks, you know, you can take high upside players later on in the draft. But the problem is if you go with Pierce with that limited upside, and this is, I mean, you can look at the stats that he had last year and you can project forward this year, and the projections don't look good. They're pretty much the same. If you're happy with that, draft him. But you shouldn't be happy with that because he's going to be in your starting lineup if you take him as in the fourth round. He's going to crack your starting lineup. And I'd
rather have AJ Dillon than him.
He is a guy that if his ADP were to say 6th or 7th round,
makes sense to me.
Absolutely. But at the ADP of 4th round, being maybe your second, maybe your first, maybe your third running back taken, you know, I'm not there because I don't want to start him if he's going to get, 50 yards and no touchdowns. That does nothing for me.
So Houston last year still ran the ball at league average about 40% of the time. But the simple fact is, do you want to have a running back who is not a vital pass catching option now that you've added a scrambling quarterback to the mix whenever you're in a spot where the team is going to be in big trouble? I mean, realistically speaking, this team, had they not traded their first pick away, could have easily won the first pick overall. All it takes is one loss to Arizona in the middle of the year. It's not a happy situation for them. Granted, they get to play Tampa, Arizona, so they get 2 really soft ones on there. But when most games line up, Texans are going to be at least a 3.5-point dog.
I want to give you these stats too, because this speaks to what we talked about earlier with Pierce and being caught on to, essentially. From week 2 to week 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he was getting his highest was 131 yards, and that was against the Chargers, and the Chargers had a notoriously bad rush defense last year. He did that on 14 carries. Took him 26 carries to get to 99 yards against Jacksonville, 20 to get to 92 yards against the Raiders. He had 35 yards against Tennessee, who we knew had a good rushing defense last year. He topped off on the Eagles somehow on Thursday Night Football for 139 yards on 27 carries.
He broke a big one.
94 yards against the Giants. Longest rush was 44 yards there. And then the next 2 games, he had 8 yards in each game. And then to end the season against a bad Cleveland team.
So bad. Their run defense is so bad.
18 carries for 73 yards. And then 22 carries for 78 yards against Dallas and a touchdown. And you look at his targets, the highest targeted amount that he had was 6 targets on the year. There's that game against the Chargers, he went 6 for 6, but it was only for 8 yards. And so he's not out producing as a passer. His, all of those touchdowns that we said, his 4 touchdowns happened earlier in the season, and one of them against the Chargers. And so you take that over the course of the rest of the season against the Giants, that's 14 points he had against the Giants would probably be his next highest total outside of the last game of the season, which you were already done.
Yeah.
And so that none of these Houston players, in my mind, are draftable at least Pierce and Schultz are not draftable at their current ADP. Nico Collins is. Mechie definitely is.
Yeah, because they're cheap.
And you could take a flyer on Robert Woods, but he's old and gets injured a lot, so he's less of a flyer for me. And Devin Singletary. Devin Singletary at running back 43, by all means, in the 14th round, 15th round.
So that's where Pierce should be. They're basically the same gamble.
Because he's in the A.J. Dillon range, and if you want to take a chance at one of those 2, by all means, do it, because you should already have 3 competent, capable running backs on your team, maybe even 4.